Top Gun Combat Zones is a flight combat game that was developed by Digital Integration, published by Titus Interactive, and released on the PS2 and GameCube in October of 2001, and that's all I want to say about this terrible game. I'll see you next week. Okay, fine, I'll give you a review. So let me just state right away to save some of you some time, this is a very bad game. Do not pick this up. Now, on one hand, I feel like I only have myself to blame on this one. Here we have a game using the Top Gun license that was made in the very early days of the 6th generation, and it was published by the same company that brought us Superman 64. On the other hand, it's a fairly straightforward arcade-style aircraft action game, and it's hard to see how you could turn such a fun premise into such a miserable experience. The game is made up of 30 plus missions, all of which are quite brief, and you can finish each in a matter of minutes. You'll fight across 3 different eras, starting off in the 70s and eventually progressing to a near future setting. Each mission throws out the usual sort of objectives that you'd find in a game like this, so it's a lot of dogfights and taking out enemy bases. So what's the problem? Well, to kick things off, this game feels awful to control. I could probably count on one hand the number of games I've played of this style, so I'm not an expert in how these games should feel, but the controls made me want to give up on this title within the first few minutes. I'm not sure how they managed to make a fighter jet feel sluggish, but they did, so congrats to them, I guess. Every time I tried to curve around for a strafing run, it actually felt like the game was working against me, and I don't mean in a this game is so realistic you have to really treat the manoeuvring of the aircraft seriously kind of way. It's more like the movement with the analog sticks is sometimes super sensitive and sometimes unresponsive. Occasionally it feels like you're turning in slow motion, and the rest of the time it feels like you could spin onto your back at any moment. Once you adjust to the incredibly frustrating controls, you'll slowly get used to landing hits on enemies with your selection of weapons. You have a standard cannon fire, along with missiles that can lock on, rockets that can't lock on for some reason, and bombs that you can drop from overhead. With all of these weapons at your disposal, you might be fooled into thinking that there's some fun to be had with the combat, but you would be wrong. All of the action in this game is either unbelievably easy or annoyingly difficult. When you are tasked with taking out helicopters or other jets, you're simply just locking onto everything in sight, and you could play with your eyes closed. When you're tasked with taking out enemies on the ground, you'll want to set this disc on fire. Once again, these shaky controls hinder your ability to complete your objectives, as you'll struggle to keep your reticle in place long enough to fire off a couple of rockets at an enemy tank. Everything about this game is presented in a very arcadey, light-hearted way. The missions are short and sweet, and you're aiming for the highest score possible to earn gold medals. It should be a breezy fun time, but instead it is anything but. I'm a big believer in no matter the production value of any piece of entertainment, the worst thing that your product can be is boring. I'm more than happy to play budget games. I spent a good chunk of my youth doing exactly that, but when a budget game also feels tedious, then you have a real problem. You can feel the lack of money behind this thing. Everything from the menus to the cutscenes and audio just screams, we were low on funds. What's worse is that the environments aren't even massively complex. They're basically all just the same barren wastelands with a few buildings and vehicles dumped into them, but you would at least think that a game with so few assets would at least have a bit of polish to them. I was also confused by the game's technical performance. As I said, the mission areas are mostly empty, but the game seemingly struggles to handle this, as there is a lot of fog that is clearly put in place to try and mask everything that is popping into existence as you fly across the map. Not only is this distracting, but it also makes it harder to spot other aircraft, so you'll spend a fair bit of time trying to find the enemies, meaning you'll spend even more time with this game, which is the real tragedy here. Typically in my reviews I discuss the sound design and voice work, but for Top Gun Combat Zones there isn't much to speak about. The only dialogue in the game is a generic voice feeding you a paragraph's worth of pre-mission info.
The base is stocked with ordnance, equipment, and supplies that we'd prefer to keep out of enemy hands, so once the troops are out, flatten whatever's left.
And the less said about the flavourless and unexciting soundtrack, the better. I think by this point it's obvious that I don't recommend it for your collection. The combination of boring and ugly is a lethal one, and for me, the list of negative aspects are almost too long to mention. Whether it's the awkward controls, the combat that bounces between mind-numbing and rage-inducing, the terrible looking textures, the lack of effort put into its presentation, there are so many reasons to pass on this game. I don't have much else to say about this title, but I will say this: in the few hours I spent playing through this game, it didn't give me a single moment of joy or excitement, and with each passing mission, I just wanted to put my controller down even more.